You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone, welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I'm Dustin and with me is Tony. We are here to discuss everything from March 13th through March 18th. There's a lot of things going on in the world, and while the world is focused on a lot of major things happening, not just here in the United States, but around the world, streaming news is coming out, so we're here to talk about some streaming stuff. We do have a major discussion related to the pandemic that is going around the world and how it relates to streaming, so we'll get to that in a minute, but let's go down our news rundown. So first up, Netflix has announced a huge slate of documentaries that are coming to the service throughout 2020. You can check out the full list over on the site. We have in the show notes the list or link to all of the projects. There's a lot of them. Also, Netflix has announced that they are teaming with Hulu and will be streaming. They will share streaming rights to the NBC sitcom Community, and this show, I have never seen it, but I know you have.
I love this show. I love Community so much. It's made by the creator of Rick and Morty. So if you've never really seen Rick and Morty, but it's created by Dan Harmon, and it's just it's such a funny show. It's set about a bunch of people at a community college and just hijinks ensue, and so it's just it's pretty hilarious. I did not know that Community was a Sony backed project, and so just reading this article for prep, I was just like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. How come they would do this type of deal? Because I thought that Community was a NBC Universal property, but it's really a Sony property, and so that's how come they were able to have agreements with both Netflix and Hulu. I don't know about you, but this is kind of weird for Netflix, because usually Netflix does a lot of exclusive things. I don't remember often that they have like non-exclusive content on their platform. Hulu, I mean, this happens all the time, but for Netflix, this seems like the first in a very long time. I mean, am I wrong there?
No, you're not wrong. I can't think of... I tried racking my brain ahead of the show, and I could not think of any property as big or as popular or as bingeable as Community that have had a situation where they have had rights shared with another service. Now, there's been plenty of deals that have been made between companies. Like, for example, originally Friends was supposed to leave the service at the end of 2018. The deal got extended to the end of 2019. They originally had the show for 5 years, and then I believe it was 5 years, and then they extended it for an extra year because they came to a deal with Warner Brothers, the company who was behind Friends. Despite the fact that it had already been announced that Friends was going to be going over to HBO Max whenever that was actually going to launch, which at the time, a lot of talk was that it was going to be in 2019, and then obviously that didn't happen, and we're still expecting it to come in May. But that was one deal. There's been other deals that have happened where shows have been changing hands. We know The Office is going to be leaving Netflix and going over to NBC Universal. They're not sharing it in any way, even though Peacock will be launching prior to the deal being done with Netflix, because the deal's not up until the end of 2020. Peacock is launching publicly, sometime this summer. So the reality of it is, I can't think of any show that this has happened, but the plus side is it's definitely a good thing that could happen for both companies. It's like a mutual situation that they both benefit from, because streaming shows or shows like this that are very bingeable, it becomes very expensive to get the licensing rights for these shows. But the idea that, services could potentially split the cost and get the licensing rights, the studio behind this, in this situation, it's Sony, they can still make what they're looking to get, but then you can basically share the rights. And there is other shows that this is happening as well. Hulu, I remember specifically when HBO Max announced that they were going to be having Rick and Morty, which is another one of those bingeable shows that a lot of people really enjoy. Hulu was very upfront with saying, yes, but we'll have the rights too. You'll still be able to see Rick and Morty on Hulu as well, because that's a split deal. And I imagine there will be other shows that this will come up with that aren't maybe as many seasons as like The Office or Friends with 9 or 10 seasons. I'm sure a deal like this could pop up for some other series down the line.
And just to clarify, I realize there's probably going to be someone who's going to kind of complain about this. Other studios do share different properties, but it might be by different regions. So Netflix might have the streaming rights versus some other company. That's not true. Maybe it's like a Disney Plus or somebody kind of smaller has the U.S. streaming rights, whereas a Netflix might have the global distribution rights. And so just to be clear, this is the first time where Netflix in kind of the U.S. region will have non-exclusive rights with a different streaming company. Just to clarify, I know somebody might be a little bit technical. This is the first time that I can remember for the U.S. market where they have non-exclusive rights to Community is a pretty well-known show, and it's definitely bingeable, and it's got its own audience, and people really do love it. And so this is the first time for the U.S. market where I can recall this happening.
Yeah, and that is important to note, because I know that there are other deals that are in place where other services have different shows in different regions. The one that immediately comes to mind is Studio Ghibli films. They're all currently on Netflix outside of the U.S., but in the U.S., they will be all available on HBO Max when it launches. It is important to note. All right, so moving on, we've got Prime Video. There's a docuseries following the French PSG soccer team that has been commissioned over at Prime Video. We have no new news for Hulu or CBS All Access. Over at Apple TV Plus, the Beastie Boys film has been postponed. Its theatrical run, it was supposed to release in IMAX at the beginning of April, but Apple has stated that despite the fact that the theatrical release is postponed, they will, however, be releasing it as planned in April on Apple TV Plus. So if you are looking forward to that, there's no delay there, despite it not be coming to the theaters as it was originally planned.
Yeah, I mean, this Beastie Boys film, this really kind of follows our main discussion later on about everything that's happening with the coronavirus, pandemic, and everything like that, and a bunch of movies that have been postponed and stuff like that. So we'll definitely cover it more, but yeah, it's definitely important news for Apple TV. One of their, they've been telling this for a while. I've been seeing a lot of press about the Beastie Boys. We've covered this film multiple times, and so just once again, kind of Apple TV just for situations not of their own doing, just kind of getting steamrolled a little bit. So it stinks for them, but this film is going to come out. We will watch it, so that's the most important part.
All right, and then Disney Plus. First up, there's a new music dance focused film called Spin that is currently in development, and then there is some new execs that have been named within Disney, which will impact streaming. Specifically, we have to call out that there is in the article itself, there's a number of executives, but specifically the ones that deal with streaming is Vanessa Morrison, who has been named president of streaming at Walt Disney Studios Motion Picture Production.
Dustin, once again, I feel like the past 3 or 4 episodes, I've had to ask this question, and I know the audience is probably going to have the same answer. It's just the same question is we keep bringing up Disney's broadening out their leadership base for, all of their media properties recently, for the movies, for TV, for Disney Plus, for Hulu, for the streaming, everything. They've really been, trying to fill out their leadership department. And once again, there's more executives. How does Vanessa Morrison fit into for the streaming, right, where the streaming war is, to fit into the streaming nature side of Disney as a company, and I guess Disney Plus and the movie films division? How does she fit into their organization?
Okay, so last episode we were talking about how the television side of things were structuring out with Disney Television Studios and all of that projects that we were talking about, and Hulu and 20th Century Television Studios, all of that we were talking about specifically had to do with all television properties. This is just TV series. This, however, is specifically dealing with the films. So basically, the appointment of this executive, Vanessa Morrison, seems to be a direct correlation to the fact that they are planning on having multiple films specifically created within Walt Disney Pictures that is created for Disney Plus. Now, it does specifically say that it's just Disney Plus. It doesn't say Hulu. It doesn't say, potentially Hotstar down the line, because they do have that as well, but it specifically says Disney Plus. Now, as we talked about last episode, there has been a Disney film that has released on the service at least once a month since the month that Disney Plus has launched, and they're going to continue to launch movies because they have a number of movies. March, the movie that was coming out was Stargirl. Last month was Timmy Failure, and then we had Togo, which was the William Dafoe dog sled movie. There was Noelle, there was Lady and the Tramp. So the point is, they're going to continue to create movies. If you average a film per month for a service, that's 12 films per year. That's almost essentially a label for certain studios. There's not a lot of companies that actually can output a movie per month. So the idea is that by having this appointment, you have somebody within Walt Disney Pictures who's specifically focusing on content that is being created specifically for Disney Plus. Now, she will be, the people who are reporting to her will actually be from 20th Century Studios and Disney Live Action, who are creating content for the larger side of, Walt Disney Studios in general, but she will be deciding, okay, this content might work better for me. We'll maybe forego the theatrical run and have it directly related to the streaming service as an exclusive for the streaming service instead. That's the intent. My understanding is that is the entire principle behind this. Previously, she served at Fox Family and Fox Animation, so she's already been within the movie industry. It's not a new role. It's just a new role within the structure. She does directly report to the president of Walt Disney Studios Motion Picture Production, Sean Bailey.
So how does she fit in with Disney creating a new unit that oversees Disney Plus, Hulu, and ESPN Plus? Does she have anything to do with that special unit that's in charge of those 3 properties?
Not that I'm aware of.
Because she's just doing movie development, right, and that unit is dealing more with television development for all their different networks. Okay. I mean, we probably didn't plan to talk about this, but is there a reason why you think Disney is separating their movie, for Disney Plus, separating their movie curation business from their like TV curation side, like the movie development from the TV development? For Disney Plus, I would seem that those would kind of go hand in hand, but once again, might not. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
So my quick take on that is that pretty much that's the structure of any major studio, is that their television stuff is separate from their movie stuff. There is occasionally some crossover. You'll occasionally see a movie that is created normally by a smaller label. Warner Horizon is a good example of that. Warner Brothers has a label called Warner Horizon that does sometimes create content that is both television and movies, but movies generally are for television. So the thing is, I think that ultimately the way the studios are built, and movies and television are obviously different, and the idea is to keep them separate. There's a reason for production for a television show compared to a movie is very different, and I think that's ultimately why they keep them separate.
I get that from a production side, but now from a leadership and organizational and a big picture side, I feel like for Disney Plus, right, or HBO Max or Apple, TV, or whatever studio you want to put in, I feel like there would need to be some synergy between, in some way, between the television and the movie side, because you want to keep putting out content that is similar, and I guess in tone. And tone is not necessarily like from a story perspective, right? It's got a dark and dreary or melancholy tone. No, I mean like a tone in terms of like brand. You want brand consistency between the film part and the television side of the business. And so for Disney Plus, right, since you're getting both of those on that platform, I feel like you would want a little bit of synergy at the somewhere in that link. And it's surprising that there really isn't. Maybe I just have a very naive take on kind of this Disney Plus situation, and I guess HBO if you want to lump them in too, but I feel like you would want some brand synergy between those 2 studios or those 2 departments. And so to me, I just find it interesting how I keep seeing this like bifurcation between TV and movies as we go into just businesses that just have a streaming component. And I find that a little bit interesting. I don't know, to me that synergy is just important for brand consistency, but maybe I'm just overthinking this one thing. So,
I mean, I'll just say this. The only thing that I could say is that obviously if you were running a company, you would want everything as streamlined as possible. I mean, and that's not a bad way to do it. I think the problem is that it's just been such a separate thing for such a long period of time that synergy has only started to exist in certain avenues. For example, you look at Marvel Studios. Marvel Studios has been, they've made 20 movies, and there's been really great connections between a lot of those films. Where it did break down, however, is exactly where you're talking about, where ABC Television Studios was creating Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and while there was some connections, there was a kind of like a fine line of how much connection you actually can have between them. And then there's the same thing with the Netflix films. Sure, they referenced things that were happening within the other films, but ultimately it came down to they were its own thing. However, that's all going to change when Marvel Studios is actually producing their own type of TV shows with the stuff that's coming to Disney Plus. I think that for certain brands, it makes perfect sense to have things all under the same roof, and Marvel is going to be a perfect example of that. Star Wars is obviously another one, because while the show is Mandalorian is not directly related to the films, it does fit within the timeline of things, and it does work better if you have somebody heading things up that knows what's going on rather than just having a lot of heads, to try to figure out how to match things up. You just have one chief instead of multiple chiefs. So, I think it just is one of those things where it can be a good thing. I'm not sure that ultimately it makes that big of a difference when you look at some of the content that's actually being created. Would it be nice if DC had all of their television and movie properties under the same brand? Certainly it would. I'm not questioning. There's been confirmed situations where DC, perfect example, Smallville. In the early 2000s, there was a show called Smallville. It was on television. They could not reference in any way, shape, or form things having to do with Batman because there was this thing called a Batman embargo. Because at the time, they were getting underway of creating a new Batman franchise with Chris Nolan, and they didn't want Batman mentioned in any way, shape, or form. So much so that they eventually went the route of bringing a character in that was meant to be Batman, but because they couldn't use Batman, they used Green Arrow instead. And Green Arrow was featured on the show very heavily in the same type of role, obviously more comedic and less dark than the character of Batman because of this so-called Bat embargo that was on the television studios. And that's not something that's unheard of. There was also an animated TV show called Teen Titans where they did not want Batman showing up in the series because Batman was going to be in a movie and they did not want too many interpretations of Batman out there. A lot of it has kind of loosened up, over the last decade compared to two decades ago. But it is exactly what you're saying. There are certain things that it makes perfect sense for there to be more synergy. I think the ultimate thing is when you look at the type of content that a lot of these studios are creating, it honestly doesn't make a big difference if there is synergy. Let's use Disney as an example. Disney is creating content for the Disney Channel, Freeform. The content that they're creating just for those different stations by themselves is very different. The content that they're creating for either creating themselves or they're bringing in from outside the company is, for Disney Junior is very different type of content. So I think the wide range of content by itself determines that do you really want to have the motion pictures overseeing all this content that's being created on television while they've got their billion-dollar movies that they're supposed to be, maintaining themselves. I think there's a reason why it's separate, but I do think that there is obviously evidence out there that having synergy can work because we're going to see a lot of that when some of the Disney Plus Marvel shows are, come to the service. We're going to see the potential of what could happen if you have television properties interacting with the movie properties and having the same executives over them. And I think that's going to be a real case study to see what happens.
Gotcha. All
right, so then Quibi, we've got, there's a comedy series called We're Never Getting Married that has been put in development. HBO Max has a Julia Child drama that is getting a pilot order. There is nothing for Peacock and no niche streaming services news that has been announced. As far as other streaming providers, Pluto TV has revealed content partnerships for their Latin America launch. They have over 55 content partnerships, which is pretty big. Movies Anywhere, which is not necessarily a streaming service, but I bring it up because I thought this was just an interesting point related to stuff that is streaming. Movies Anywhere is a service that a lot of the major studios back as far as digital copies that you actually have access to, whether you buy them from a digital retailer like Vudu or iTunes. You have access variety of different platforms to actually access them instead of just being only allowed to use it at the one platform. So let's say you buy all your stuff on iTunes, you no longer have Apple products, you want to get away from the Apple stuff, and you want to start using Amazon, and you want to watch your films on there. Movies Anywhere allows you to watch them. There's just a couple of studios that are not involved with that. Out of the major players, Paramount and Lionsgate are the two that are out of the major studios that aren't involved in it. But it's a huge backing. It eliminated the need for ultraviolet copies, which is what they originally, what they used to be called. And now it's just Movies Anywhere. Even Disney's part of it. So they're launching a new feature that actually allows a selection of films to actually be shared to other people. And this is interesting because this is the first kind of situation where this has happened, in my knowledge, where basically the breakdown of the feature is that you will have the ability to basically loan up to 3 movies per month to somebody else who has a Movies Anywhere account, and then they'll be able to watch it within 72 hours of the original watch, or it'll expire at the end of the month. So the idea is that if you own a movie, you can allow one of your friends to watch the movie themselves without having to have them go pay for it. So the idea is basically sharing rights of your ownership of the film. And I thought that was kind of unique. I use Movies Anywhere specifically through Vudu, and it would be a benefit if I could share movies with certain people and say like, hey, yes, here, check out this movie. So I thought that was a cool thing. All right, and then finally, as far as other streaming providers, Fox has officially bought Tubi.
It feels like we've been talking about that for like weeks now, that they're going to buy Tubi, and it's finally happened. So good.
I think it was, I want to say it was right around New Year's or Christmas time that news first came out that Fox was interested in buying Tubi. It was also around the same time that Comcast said that they were interested in buying Xumo. And everybody's belief was that it was these major corporations were, these major media companies were interested in buying these streaming services because of Pluto TV's success at Paramount, or Viacom CBS, that is, not necessarily Paramount, but Viacom CBS. And Comcast did end up buying Xumo, and now Fox is buying Tubi. Now, there's a little bit different of a reason for Fox. Supposedly, the reason why Fox wanted to buy Tubi was not necessarily just for the Pluto TV aspect, but they're looking at creating their own streaming service. And they ended up paying $440 million for Tubi. And I honestly believe that while there will be an avenue for them to have something like Pluto TV, at least for the foreseeable future with Tubi, I honestly do believe that in the future, there's going to be a service similar in the vein of what we are hearing Viacom CBS is creating, what Peacock is planning on launching, where there's multiple tiers with different types of content. The only catch, of course, is that Fox doesn't have a lot of content other than news and sports. They've sold their studio and their television production company off to Disney, so there's not a lot of content that they actually have the rights. I don't think they have any library whatsoever at this point, unless they were to use some of that money to actually go buy smaller companies that existed out there. I don't know that, and I don't know that they even want to get back into that because they've divested the very different parts of the company so much, and Disney owns such a large chunk of what they previously owned. They'd basically be back at the ground building up whatever they have. So I'm not sure the approach that they would be going for. However, obviously they have an avenue of delivering their news and sports on a service like Tubi. We've heard the Fox Sports channels have had issues with the regional networks having issues with some of the other streaming players out there, things like that. So maybe this is a way for them to not, forego having issues and to cause people to have to purchase this other service that is out there. Tubi obviously is a free service at this time, but it could change. So we'll see.
I've been trying to figure out and wrap my head around, how does this work in a business context for them? How does this fit into their portfolio? How are they going to utilize Tubi and all their subscribers? And I think you summed it up the best, that it's really just a way for them to push away some of the risk that, Sling or some of these other providers are kind of bring into their business. And so, from that angle, it makes sense. But for me, I've been sitting here for a few days after hearing this news. It's just like, how is this going to fit? How is this going to fit into Fox? And especially, Fox Now. I think you summed it up the best. So,
all right. So that is all of the news rundown. Now we're going to get into our main discussion. And I want to start off by saying there's very few situations in the world where major things that are happening in the world are going to cross into topics that we talk about here on the podcast. It's not something that's going to happen a lot. I actually don't foresee a lot of world events taking place and having some sort of immediate effect on streaming in general. So we probably won't have a lot of opportunities to actually have major issues within the world crossing over to what we discuss here on the podcast. However, currently the world is facing some massive turmoil with the coronavirus. It started off in Asia and it's slowly spread around the world, and now the U.S. is dealing with it while other countries are dealing with large infection rates and things like that. The reality of it is, this is an interesting time for the future of streaming. And while I don't want in any way, shape, or form to take away from the severity of what's going on, it is definitely important to do everything that your local officials are suggesting that you do. Continue to wash your hands, try to keep your distance, only go out as often as necessary, things like that. But the streaming world of everything is something that is immediately affected by things that's happening right now in the world, regardless of where you are. So our main discussion, which I know that last episode we said we had a different discussion, we're going to forego that conversation because this is happening right now as we speak, and there's a lot of varying pieces out there that's happening because of the pandemic that's across the world. So specifically, we're going to try to stick to how this is affecting streaming. We've got a couple of different news points and things that we want to discuss. So here's the basic idea. Obviously, a lot of people around the world, as this becomes a bigger and bigger concern, are trying to stay home and not go out. What does that mean? That means, right now in America, or in the United States, we have theaters that are saying that they are going to be closing their doors for the next 8 weeks. We have governors that are closing restaurants and bars and public places, and we have sporting events that are, foregoing the rest of their seasons and things like that. And there's major events that are just not taking place. There's no concerts. There's no live shows. There's no theater productions. None of that stuff is actually happening. So what happens when all of that stuff is not able to be enjoyed? People still have to find a way to have some sort of enjoyment while dealing in these difficult times. And a lot of it has to do with, people have streaming services. So how much content is out there that you can watch, and then you start to get a better idea once you have more free time on your hands that there is a ton of content available at your fingertips all the time. So there's a couple of real quick news points that I want to bring out that I thought were really interesting about that all relate to this. And then there's certain things that we're going to discuss in general, but specifically what this has done specifically for the industry of streaming is that obviously more people are using streaming services. However, the production side is the side that's being faced with the major issues when it comes to streaming, which is practically every major show that's currently in production for any streaming service, regardless of where it is, has actually shut down production or delayed their production of certain things because of fear that this virus could be spread even more than it already has. For honestly, the past week, I've seen multiple headlines. I've seen more headlines talking about how shows are shutting down production amid fears than any other kind of news headlines that are actually out there related to the streaming services, because that's just what's happening. Now, there's streaming services that are immediately reacting to what's happening. For example, Disney Plus announced just before the weekend that as of this past Sunday, they were making Frozen 2 available immediately on Disney Plus, which was 3 months earlier than it was expected to arrive on the service. And a lot of that stems from the fact that obviously there's a lot of schools across the nation have actually shut down and people are in their homes. To be fair, while it's great on Disney for releasing it, it's also a business decision, because for those people who are not currently subscribed to Disney Plus, you do have a 7-day free trial. And if you do sign up. So the idea is you sign up because you know Frozen 2 is on the service, and then you see that your children are actually utilizing the service, and you find a value in the service as a whole, and then continue the subscription. I would not be surprised if we heard about subscription booms across a lot of the different services that are out there over this trying time that the world is facing. There's also a situation that deals with a lot more of our larger discussion point, and we're going to get to that in a second, but I do want to call out, I want anybody out there who is not necessarily subscribed to a specific service. Let's say, for example, you just subscribe to Netflix. Almost every service out there offers a free trial, and I encourage you that if you are, I guess, not finding a lot of content on Netflix, which I know a lot of people are like, well, there's tons of content on Netflix, and there is. But if you are looking for other content, consider some of the other streaming services that are out there. A lot of them are offering trials. Some of them are offering extended trials during this time where you can absorb some of the content and actually check it out. I know HBO specifically has a 7-day free trial. They also have free pilots that you can watch for a lot of their popular shows that you don't even have to sign up for the trial in order to watch. There's other services that offer 7-day trials. Apple TV Plus has a 7-day trial, Disney Plus. There's lots of services that offer trials, so definitely take advantage of that trial and do that, because while everybody has the time, the other aspect of this, of course, is that do you have the funds to actually continue to do this? Because there's certain people, vast majority of people are being told don't come to work. There's businesses that are being closed indefinitely for the foreseeable future because of what's currently happening. And the idea is that some people might not have a job. So what I say is to you, don't sign up necessarily for a service. Just try the trial, enjoy some of the content while you have the time, and try to enjoy the situation, even though it is a bad situation. Try to make the best of the situation while you are, potentially at home for a long period of time. So the larger discussion, however, is the fact that there is some other things that are happening within the streaming side of things, not necessarily related specifically to the streaming side of things, but how it will potentially have an effect on the streaming industry as a whole later on down the road. So to bring you up to speed, there's been a couple of things that have developed in the past week. First off, Disney announced that Star Wars Rise of Skywalker which was not supposed to be going on sale until April, is actually going to become available digitally right away. You can purchase it immediately. It's not going to end up on Disney Plus for the foreseeable future, but it is available much earlier than it was originally anticipated. I don't believe it was actually supposed to release to the public for at least another 3 weeks or something like that. So it's releasing earlier. Then Universal came out and said, well, we have a bunch of films that are currently in theaters right now. They have The Invisible Man, the movie Emma, they have The Hunt, and there's a movie Trolls Worldwide Tour, World Tour, which was supposed to come out the beginning of April. All 4 of these movies are either released towards the beginning of March or going to the beginning of April. And they've decided, now that a lot of the theaters are closing, that they're completely foregoing the 90-day theatrical window and saying we're going to release these immediately so people can start watching them. And again, this is all business decisions. While there is a major conglomerate conveniently it's called NATO, which is not the NATO you're thinking, it's called the North American Theaters Organization. They are very adamant about not breaking these theatrical windows, but also during this time where theaters are closing for up to potentially 8 weeks, it leaves these studios in a kind of a situation where if they just release their film, they're not getting the people to watch the films that they want because people aren't going to the theaters. And the theaters recognize that because just this past weekend, the box office had the lowest box office it's had in a very, very, very long time because people are trying to stay away from public situations. The theaters immediately are reacting to that and saying, okay, we're going to close down. But it leaves a lot of these studios that have produced $1 million films kind of in a crossroads. What do you do? Certain movies are being just held back. You've got Mulan, Fast and the Furious 9, other films that are being held and not releasing as planned, and they're just going to release at some other point down the line. While you have other films like the Trolls World Tour, which is only estimated to make somewhere in the neighborhood of less than $30 million the opening weekend. Does it make more sense for it to release early? There's the Vin Diesel movie, it's not Bloodsport, I don't remember, or Bloodshot. It's a property that's based off a Valiant comic, but Vin Diesel's starring in it. It was supposed to be coming out, I believe, this coming weekend. They've announced that they're also going to be releasing that film digitally right away. So the question that I want to talk about and the discussion that I want to have with you is, do you think that this current situation that we're experiencing across the world is going to open studios' eyes up to the idea of cutting out the middleman of theaters? Or are we going to see more movies that aren't necessarily bound to make $100-200 million or more? Do you think that we're going to start to see some of these films move more towards the streaming side of things? Almost every major studio has either currently a streaming service or is headed in a direction where they will have a streaming service in the near not so distant future. Do you think what do you think of the current situation with these theatrical releases coming out much sooner than everyone is anticipating, specifically as a reaction to what's going on?
First of all, when I was doing research and I read NATO, I was like, why is NATO, right, this military organization, have any input on like people going to theaters? It really confused me until I kind of read the fine print and what NATO really was in this context. So that was a funny moment for me. I was reading, I was like, what does the North Atlantic Treaty Organization have to do with theater watching? So that was pretty fun doing research. Overall, there have been a lot of reports of how streaming is going to, we talk about the streaming wars. Well, now it's just going to be streaming life. Like everything we're going to do is streaming. Like streaming is the new norm. Movies are going to come out just direct to streaming services, and that is the new norm. Where I disagree with that, but I think it's going to be a little bit of a business decision. It's going to be a little bit about basically doing a lot of math. And okay, like some movies, yeah, we're going to need to hit the theaters, the theater chains, to really rack up a big box office so that we can pay for some of these movies. Because like if you think about a lot of the superhero movies that are coming out or have come out, like there's no way that you could have paid for Endgame, right? That had any positive return on investment if you just released Endgame to Disney Plus. Like Endgame's budget was like over $300 million. Like it was a stupid amount in terms of budget for a movie, and there's no way that you can recoup that. So in a lot of big budget, just action movies, right, heavy CGI or north of like $250 million, I think it's mathematically, there's no way that that's sustainable for a streaming service. There just isn't. How many Brights have they made on Netflix? Like they haven't really, they've really knocked it out of the park with like lower budget films that have a great story but don't have that many set pieces, don't have that many props, like one or two main big actors, you know. There's no way that streaming services can fill in the gap that theater chains serve. However, there are movies that if the box office is supposed to be expected to be lower, like you can make that gamble. And it's just going to be a lot of math. It's going to be about what is the best for us as a business. Now, that isn't what people necessarily want to hear. But that's what they're going to do. That's what analysts are going to tell them to do. That's a good, smart business play. If I was a shareholder, like what would I expect the company to do? I see a world where you're going to have some movies that will go direct to streaming, and then you have some movies that are going to hit theaters. But the ones that are going to hit theaters are going to be ones that have huge budgets that expect to get like north of 500 million plus, you know, in terms of revenue back from just the theater chains, the box office revenue, to really fund these types of movies. And then these other ones, they're going to be lower budget, but have a great story with them, right? I think those might hit direct to streaming to prop up like a Disney Plus or a Netflix or a Hulu or whatever, as to kind of lead the charge on of the service. And that's like my future. I think right now with the COVID-19 and the coronavirus and everything that's going on, I think a lot of studios are going to have to make once again, a math decision, right? The normal theatrical window is about 90 days. That's why Netflix is consistently had an issue, and why The Irishman, they had to negotiate with the big theater chains like AMC and whatnot to potentially try to change that release cycle. But going on this 90 days, right, assuming, let's just keep it as it is it more financially viable for us to release it now, recoup that money for this 90 days, just keep it as is, earn whatever we do, and then release it to our streaming service? Or can we take this opportunity? Once again, I know that there's a lot going on in the world, but just think of it from a objective as you can. Going on with everything that's in the world, is it better for us just to use this as a marketing opportunity for our streaming platform to prop up like our Disney Plus, our Hulu, to not release this in a theater, make it as a banner for right now? People are at home to try to use a streaming service, and let's really use this as a marketing push. And what is the math behind that? Do you think new subscribers will offset the amount that we're going to lose? What about, you know, historically, what is for Disney Plus? What is our conversion rate? You know, we might get somebody for a week, but how often do those people stay after the trial period's over? And you got to do a little bit of math and figure out, okay, what's your customer on this? You know, if it's a kids movie, what is the churn rate for people that just kind of mainly watch like kids stuff? Like you got to do all this crazy stuff. But I think that they're going to kind of outweigh and see, okay, is foregoing this 90 days in the theater chain even worth our time? So if it is, then let's make it the banner. Let's do it great right now for, I think, people that are home who are choosing not to go out to practice social distancing. I think it's great for them to watch stuff, but you know, you got to make that business decision. And I think that that's where a lot of these studios are. I could see a movie like New Mutants, which has been delayed just indefinitely, right? They've had so many production issues. I can see Disney just being like, hey, there is some audience for this. We inherited this project. We haven't really spent that much money besides marketing. Put this on Hulu. Let's let this drive. I can see that happening. Lower budget films, I can see them putting it direct to the streaming service. But, for the Black Widow or for the Vin Diesel movie, right? Ones that are expected to really bring in either a large or just a non-insignificant amount, right? Something significant amount of box office. I can see them, okay, are we just going to delay this movie until a time where we can release it in the box office? I think that's important. I texted you a few days ago about how I was happy that Frozen finally got released. Like, this was before the coronavirus was really big in my area. So, I was keeping up with the world news, but I wasn't really thinking about like quarantining myself. I just was really wanted to watch Frozen 2 with my daughter. And so I was waiting for that to happen. And it finally happened for not so great circumstances, but we got it now and that's great. But you made a good point that it's really going to hurt into like home DVD sales. And I don't see a lot of people talking about that. And if you do straight to streaming, you're really kind of nerfing that market. And I get why they moved up Frozen 2 in, because right now no one's really going to wanting to go to the store to even buy DVDs. But that's something you also have to take into account for the future of, okay, you have this theatrical release and then you have home DVD sales, then you release it streaming. Like, that's kind of the normal thing that you've done for a long time. And if you do just direct to streaming, you're kind of nerfing home sales. And although Disney's has made it a really big push to go into digital, still having some period between theatrical and then streaming for like DVD sales, I think is important, or online rental sales are important. So I think if I'm going to take like a long view of the situation, I can see where they're going to have some movies, they're going to go straight to streaming, but they might have a $10 to $15, maybe $10 to $20, charge, kind of what's happening right now, where you can get it exclusive early on Disney Plus, right? Let's just say Frozen comes out, right? And then a little bit, you can get it for like $20. You can get it exclusively early for 3 months or 6 months before everyone else does normal service. I can see situations where that happening, where, okay, you might get people who would pay $15 to $20 just to rent it early, and you'd still kind of get back a little bit of that cost. I mean, I would definitely pay, Rise of the Skywalker, if it just went, instead of the movie theater, went straight to like, Disney Plus or Hulu, I would definitely pay like $25 to watch that movie immediately and not want to wait, 3 to 6 months. So I see a business plan like that happening in the future. But once again, I don't think theaters are going to go out. I don't think streaming is going to be the complete dominant force in how we watch new content. But I think there's going to be a rise in streaming. And I think that the current situation right now with the coronavirus is kind of accelerating that trend. But I definitely think that theaters are going to have an important place.
Yeah, and to be clear, the thing is, ultimately, it just comes down to these films that are being released early on streaming that is cannibalizing the home video market for these companies, which they do still heavily rely on that market to bring in a lot of money. A movie can make $1 billion, but they could actually still bring in $500 million in home video. The home video sales aren't talked about as much as the box office because it's not the flashy number that everyone wants to talk about. A movie comes out and immediately it's judged on how successful it is based off of how well it does at the box office. But a lot of people don't realize that the theaters actually eat up a portion of that box office. They take that out because they are the middleman between the studio and the consumer who is purchasing the ticket. I think the thing is, it is a giant math problem as far as, okay, how much money is this film going to cost to make? How much money are we going to potentially lose by foregoing putting it in theaters? How much money will we make based off of it being on the streaming service? How much money will we lose by not having this movie available on home video? Now, there's a different approach here, too. There are services out there that do release things on the streaming services exclusively there, and you can still go onto the service and watch those shows, but they still make their products available, for the home video market to the people who aren't subscribing to the services. This is something that is very prominent within Warner Brothers and Viacom CBS. The Star Trek series that they have on CBS All Access is obviously exclusive to CBS All Access, but it does become available on a physical disc down the line. And the same thing can be said about a lot of the Warner Brothers series that they have out there. The shows that are on DC Universe make their way to physical release and digital release as well. So people who aren't subscribing to the services do have the ability to purchase them. I have not seen that situation over at Disney with any of the films that they've done. You've got Lady and the Tramp. They're clearly going for the Netflix route where you have this show or film exclusively on the service. The only place you can actually view it is actually on the service, not in a physical form. That's not something you typically see down the line. However, I do believe that we're moving in a direction, and I'm almost positive we've talked about this before. In general, when you look at Disney as a company and the movies that they actually put in theaters, they are such a large company that has so many larger franchises, whether it be or production companies like Lucasfilm or Marvel Studios or Walt Disney Pictures or Walt Disney Animation or Pixar. When you look at the companies that are producing content, they already are at a situation where they have so many projects that are actually releasing in theaters that you almost have to sit there and say, hold on, maybe we have too many, because if we release this movie too close to this movie, it's going to eat away at the box office. And we already saw that last year when they started to have a lot of Fox films that were releasing around the same time as some of the other films. You had Aladdin release 1 week. You had Dark Phoenix release 2 weeks later. And I'm not trying to compare the two films in quality in any way, but you do see a situation where moviegoers are having to choose between two different offerings that you currently have in the theater at the exact same time. That works perfectly if you have got a Marvel movie and a Pixar film. It's not necessarily the same exact audience that you're trying to appeal towards, but there's a line on how many projects you can actually have. And Disney produces a lot of content between all of the different sections of their studios that they actually create content. They have more content than they have available weeks without cannibalizing their own release schedule. So I think that it is going to get to a point, we're seeing it right now with Disney Plus, where Disney Plus is creating movies exclusively for their service. These are types of films and projects that Disney would have been working on, let's say, 10 years ago, but they don't make enough money at the box office to warrant to continue to do them, and it just becomes a thing that's out there while it could be taking up a slot of a film that could be potentially making a lot more money. So I do believe that in the long run of things, we're going to see more and more services creating more films that are much lower end budget, because I think that's where the sweet spot is for these companies. If you can create a film that is within a reasonable budget and you're not expecting it to launch and make a ton of money, there's no reason you can't put it on a streaming service instead, because ultimately we know churn is the biggest thing when it comes to the streaming services. You don't want your customer to go too long without more content that they will watch, whether it be a back catalog like Disney has, or whether it's the Netflix approach, which is creating an insane amount of new content every single month. You have to keep your customer engaged with your service in order to keep them from ending their subscription, to keep the company continuing to bring in money for more subscriptions. That's the name of the game when it comes to churn. You want to keep your customers. So by offering these films, it gives you the ability. Now, to be clear, and I also want to point this out, we are talking about streaming and the effects of what this theatrical window could do, and these films that are releasing early, as soon as or before they actually premiered in theaters. To be clear, none of these films, except for Frozen 2 coming out a little sooner than it should have, which had nothing to do with theatrical window. I want to make that clear. It had to specifically do with, it had already released on physical disc and digitally. It just is releasing much sooner on the service than it is. The other films that we talked about, they're the ones who are breaking the theatrical window, but it's specifically for sales. They're not going to be on a service. Now, who's to say that might not change? I mean, there's been push from a lot of the studios to try to shorten that 90-day theatrical window, because sometimes it's not in their best interest to have that. When you've got a film that does the vast majority of the money, the first 2 weeks it's out, but then it still has to wait another 10 more weeks before it can actually release on digital or disc. That's a problem for companies, especially when there's a hype around something. So I think that the industry as a whole could change. No, theaters are not going to go anywhere. We as a society will weather this storm and theaters will bounce back. However, I do think that in the future, the main draw for going to the theater is going to be the larger blockbusters, and we are going to see a significantly less number of mid and lower budget films in theaters because there's just no reason for it.
Ran over really quickly, and I think a lot of people aren't talking about. There's been a lot of delays in terms of production of either movies or TV shows, either streaming or just for the classic cable or going to theaters. I think that there's going to be, I think right now it's going to be okay, but I think if things keep going the way they are, right, and the social distancing and the quarantining and stuff like that are going to be kept in effect for, a few more months, I can see there really being a dry up in the content pipeline of, getting new properties out on these streaming services, just streaming, right? I can see there really being just very few pieces of content just releasing in the future. And, that's a crisis in and of itself, but it also leaves into a question of, okay, well, if we get to this point as a business, okay, what are our streaming services going to do? Like, how are they going to make money? Obviously, we are not allowed we're not allowed to gather more than a certain amount of people. So we're not allowed to have a production studio or a production to even continue on these television shows or movies. So, what are we going to do? And it might increase the importance of, this bingeable backlog content of Friends or The Office or Community or other shows like that, and make their importance even more in a world where new content really isn't being made and people are still going to be at home streaming. And that's something else to think about too, that we might see, and that this coronavirus might exacerbate just the importance of that backlog. And thankfully, Netflix is in a good position right now. But, whenever HBO Max drops, they're going to be in a good position as well, just due to the amount of bingeable shows that they got that you can watch over and over and over again. So I think that's something else that people haven't really talked about, but I think it's really going to be important. And if it keeps going the way it is for in the next 6 to 9 months, there might be a content shortage that occurs. I don't know if you're kind of getting that same vibe, but that's kind of what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I definitely think there's going to be a shortage, but I think that most likely what will happen is instead of a drought of content, I think what we're going to see is content that may have originally been planned, not necessarily scheduled or announced yet. But I think that if Netflix has not a lot of content, I think that you're just going to see periods of time where there's less content that's coming out. They'll have stuff more spread out. So they still have a consistent flow. They just won't have as much as we're used to, because I think that's just what's going to happen. Now, for services like HBO Max that haven't even launched, that have a number of shows in production, that presents some dilemmas in and of itself, because they're already, obviously they've got lots of shows that are in the works, but the question is how many of those shows are actually ready to go. And if you have 2 months off in the midst, we've seen before, just within the television industry, when you have writer strikes or you have the different unions that strike, you see these massive issues where the effects last for 6 months. It's not just a simple thing that you can just fix very easily by getting back on schedule and just having a short break. When there's massive times off, you have to have a huge amount of time to get back everything into the groove, because everything shuts down. Production stops. You could be in pre-production for things, and suddenly it completely stops, and then suddenly you're in a position where everything is not moving forward, and it's not as simple as just, we need 2 months to get everything back on track. No, it could be that. So I honestly believe that what will most likely happen is content that is already created, that hasn't had an official release date announced necessarily, will just get slid around so that it's a better spread. So they still have content, we just won't see as much as we are typically used to. So to wrap up the episode, there's a number of trailers that have released. Most of them have to do with Quibi projects that are coming very soon, because Quibi is right around the corner and they've been releasing a number of new trailers. Our secondary discussion, which we talked was going to be our main discussion, which was the companies quietly divesting. Our plan is to get back to that next week. We'll see what happens in this ever-changing environment of news. You never know what will happen, so we still plan on going back to that at some point, because it is a conversation we'd like to have. So with all of that being said, before we actually round out the episode, in this time of, potentially self-quarantining yourself or just trying to social distance yourself from other people, and I strongly encourage all of our listeners to practice social distancing, try to stay in as much as you possibly can, and check out some of the streaming services. So we want to end this episode with just a couple of suggestions of different content that you may not have watched, but shows that we would suggest you check out because, one, there's a decent amount of content to watch out there, and two, why not make some suggestions for things that you might not be thinking of? So, Tony, why don't you give us a suggestion first?
I am not a bandwagon person. I think I said at the very beginning of the show, of the podcast, and we were talking about Game of Thrones. I am not a bandwagon person. I've heard multiple times that Mrs. Marvelous Maisel on Amazon Prime Video is an amazing show and I should watch it. And I told them, no, I'm not going to watch it because I'm that guy who doesn't like bandwagons. Well, I saw the new trailer while doing the show and I was like, seems funny. And then a good friend of mine recommended it to me and I was like, you know what, I'll give it a chance. And he's the guy who also recommended me Game of Thrones. And so my wife wanted to watch a comedy and I couldn't really find one. And I was like, hey, let's check out the show. This is Marvelous Maisel. I heard it's really funny. It's about a female comic in the 50s. Like, okay, that's going to be hilarious. And so we watched it and I just couldn't stop watching the show. It's just so hilarious. And I love stand up and she's just Rachel Brosnan is just so witty and I love her humor and I just love everything about the show. And so that is my pick. And I apologize to all the Miss Marvelous Maisel lovers of the show. I should have listened to you sooner. And my gosh, it's just a hilarious show. So we're nearing the back half of season 1 and we will try to finish that. What about you, Dustin? What's one of your shows that you've been really liking recently?
So the one that comes to mind for me that I obviously mention all the time is Ozark. I would obviously check out Ozark season 1 and 2. Conveniently, season 3 is right around the corner. I would say check that out. That is something that I would suggest. Another show that I've suggested in the past isn't super it's definitely bingeable, but there's not a lot of episodes because it's just a limited series. Is a series called The Bodyguard on Netflix. I would suggest checking that out. Yeah. A couple of other ones, obviously just bingeable shows that everybody always talks about that are available on a variety of different services. You've got Game of Thrones, which is obviously available on HBO Go and HBO Now. Parks and Rec is available on Netflix. You've got The Office on Netflix right now. Stranger Things on Netflix. Breaking Bad's over on Netflix. You've got Buffy the Vampire Slayer over on Hulu. You've got, all the FX shows are now over on Hulu too, so there's tons of stuff. If you haven't seen a lot of the content that FX has been producing, you definitely need to, because there's a lot of good stuff over there. Orphan Black, I will say at least the first 3 seasons are really good. I didn't really like the last couple seasons, but that's over on Amazon Prime. Overall, there's a ton of content out there. Probably 2 of my favorite shows that I watched ages ago was I watched all 7, or I believe it was 7 seasons of The West Wing. That's on Netflix. But the first show that I actually ever binge watched completely was Friday Night Lights, also on Netflix. I believe I imagine it's still. See,
I've never been a big fan of Friday Night Lights. That's like all my high school friends are so mad at me right now because I never liked the show. Yeah, I still feel the little bit of shame from them as I go on today, but I can never get into that show.
Yeah, I will say this. It's one of those shows where I don't know that I'd ever watch it again. West Wing, The Office, I could see rewatching those. I watched Friday Night Lights. I enjoyed it. I binge watched it. I watched all the seasons in a very short amount of time. I want to say it was 2 weeks. I watched all, I believe, 5 or 6 seasons. I enjoyed it a lot, but it's not a show that I could ever see myself going back and watching again, but I do believe it was. One show that is always suggested to me that I've never watched, that I say this, but I have so much stuff on my list of stuff I want to see. And unfortunately, despite the fact that everyone has more time to watch streaming services, I work out of the house, so I don't have any extra time. And on top of that, I've got my 3 children at home with me currently.
And you're trying to move. That too. Yeah.
So I've got a lot on my plate, so I probably won't actually actually get. But one show that everybody always suggests to me when I talk about, hey, what's a show that you really enjoyed, is The Wire.
Never seen that.
It's an HBO show, but that's something, the premise, the trailers that I've seen, it is definitely a show that I would probably really get into. I just have never found the time to actually get in, start watching it. But that could be said about a lot of shows. I just have to be in the right mood in order to get into watching a series. But then if I get into it, I really enjoy it, then it's nonstop, and I just keep watching it.
Well, you gave definitely more than one recommendation.
Yes.
Another recommendation that I would do is How I Met Your Mother. I will never stop singing the praises of the show. I love it. I can get to the point where I can quote it. My wife hates it. Well, she just thinks it's hilarious. I can quote the show as it goes. I think it's better than Friends, and I'll die on that stance. But if you want another show, another sitcom out there that lasts for 9 seasons, that is about a group of friends just hanging out, drinking beers, enjoying life in this time, then How I Met Your Mother is great. A very obscure show that I do recommend if you have the time for those people is Fringe. Now it's a J.J. Abrams show, an Alex Kurtzman show. Definitely, it aired in 2008, concluded in 2013. It's very like sci-fi-ish. It's kind of feels like the X-Files a little bit, but it's a great show that's definitely underappreciated, I think. It's really hard to find Fringe fans out there. Definitely kind of like Community fans. Like, people really like Community, but like, it's there's like a small subset. Everyone loves The Office, but a little bit less people like Community. But those people that like it, they love that show. And so, same thing for Fringe. It's a great like mystery sci-fi show. Deals with like parallel universes a little bit. Deals with like other crazy stuff that happens just in life. It's very, very X-Files-y, but definitely more on the science-based. So if you have the time, you could check down the show. I definitely recommend it. If you just want something just very odd out there, not the norm, Netflix probably won't recommend it to you. So that's definitely one of those recommendations. So in this time of you're staying in, you have to stream, right? You have to watch something on the streaming service. Try to branch out, watch something new, watch something that's you haven't really watched before.
So there's a lot of different things to check out. Definitely do that. As I said earlier, please be safe out there. Please wash your hands, practice social distancing, stay in if you can. Try to be a good human being. So, with all of that being said, be sure to follow us on Twitter and join our Discord for all these articles that we talk about here on the podcast and some that we don't. Follow us on Instagram for all these announcements related to new episodes of the podcast. This podcast is available on all sorts of different podcast platforms. We'd greatly appreciate you giving the show a review wherever you are listening to us. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or topics you'd like us to talk about on future episodes, be sure to send us an email at thestreamingwars@gmail.com. With all of that being said, for Tony and myself, this has been The Streaming Wars, and please be safe.
Thanks for listening to The Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.